Buongiorno. Good morning. So I think I go to record just here. Good morning. I'm Pierluigi Musaro, professor of sociology at the University of Bologna, and I'm very glad and grateful for this seminar today because we will talk about cosmopolitanism, mobility and visual politics, the legacy of John Berger, with two professors who are very into the topic and who are also very good friends. We are good friends, but they are good friends, which I think it's great for having a dialogue that is not just an academic discussion, but is something that go into the specificity of what we are going to talk. We have Nikos Papastergiadis, who is a professor at the University of Melbourne. He's director of the research unit in public culture at the University of Melbourne, but he's also a cosmopolitan guy. He's from Greece, and he's always traveling around the world, especially in Singapore, where he's professor in the Art Design and Media School in Singapore, and he's also co-chair of the Greek Center for Contemporary Culture. So I think that the cosmopolitanism, starting with the Greek background, is well grounded. And in dialogue with him, we have Sandro Mezzadra, who I'm very glad also is here with us. Sandro Mezzadra is a colleague at the University of Bologna. He teaches political theory here, and he's also adjunct professor at the Western Sydney University and in Hong Kong. So always there is this Australian-Asia link. Sandro Mezzadra wrote a lot of books on this topic, especially on migration, borders. I really loved Diritto di fuga, Migrazioni, Cittadinanza, Globalizzazione, almost 20 years ago, but was really opening a new perspective into the way we as researchers should do research into the topic of migration. And also I really love the Border as Method, or the multiplication of labor, that he written with Brett Nielsen, a professor at the University of Sydney, right? Western Sydney. And the last book is The West and the Rest, Capital and Power in a Multipolar World. So today here, we are starting from this book, which is a book that Nikos Papastergiadis wrote a couple of years ago during the COVID period. And this is a very interesting book. I won't tell you a lot right now because I would like also Sandro to introduce the dialogue. But really, to be honest, I met Nikos Papastergiadis a few years ago in Melbourne. Was the classical email that you send to a colleague in another university when you are visiting, and you say, you know, if you have time, I would like to discuss with you. And you say, yes, please come for a coffee. And then I went for a coffee, and then the coffee was a lunch, then there was a seminar, then the aperitivo, then the dinner. And then, you know, I was kind of in his house in Melbourne, and then even in his house in Greece. And so it was really this kind of a very, very hospitality relationship. And then reading this book, I discovered that he has a great master for this, who was John Berger. John Berger is a famous writer, professor, critical thinker, art curator, and so, but was also a person in a very close relationship with Nikos Papastergiadis. So it's great because the way Nikos wrote this book is not just an academic, critical reflection of what another academic wrote or discovered or something, but is more an intimate memoir of a relationship with this person. But I leave the floor to Sandro Mezzadra to introduce the book and to have the first comment, and then we will be in dialogue, and I hope that you will participate also. Please, Sandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to stage a dialogue with Nikos and
Adesso li silenzio tutti.
Another one we have.
Perfetto.
Okay. And I thank Pierluigi for taking the initiative to organize this seminar and for inviting me. I will start from a book that came out almost 25 years ago, a book by Nikos Papastergiadis, bearing the title The Turbulence of Migration. I will also kind of follow Nikos with respect to the tone of his book on his relationship with John Berger. And I will also start with a couple of personal experiences. The Turbulence of Migration came out in 2000, at the end of the 1990s, which is the decade to which John Berger and me is dedicated. As many of you know, the 1990s were the decade in which Italy visibly became also a country of immigration. And as many friends and colleagues in those years, I was kind of challenged by this transition that was kind of transforming the Italian society. And I was looking for conceptual tools for understanding the challenges of migration. Globalization, deterritorialization, hybridity, the keywords that figure in the subtitle of Nikos' book, sounded like good candidates. And this is why Nikos' book was really important for me in writing Diritto di Fuga, whose first edition came out in the following year, in 2001. In 2004, I included an article of Nikos on the specter of invasion in Australian politics, in a book that I edited, I confini della libertà, the borders or the boundaries of freedom, a book that played a role in this country in opening up new spaces for critical investigation of migration. And maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe it was reading the turbulence of migration that I first came across a photographic book by John Berger and Jim Moore, A Seventh Man. This is a photographic book that came out in 1975 and was immediately translated into Italian. The Italian edition came out in 1976, but it was completely forgotten in the 90s, so that I discovered the Italian edition after getting a copy of the English edition. I encourage you to take a look at the book because it is worth doing that. I leave it here for you. The book is an amazing report of the experience of the guest workers in Western Europe. It follows migrant workers from their departure through the moment of work, and then in some cases it also portrays their return. In many respects, also A Seventh Man by John Berger and Jean Moore was doomed to shape my own gaze on migration. I think the notion of gaze is very important in order to understand the work John Berger and Jean Moore were doing in this book. Their own gaze, but also the migrants' gaze, the kind of interplay between these two gazes shapes the whole book. John trusted the migrant's eye, Nikos writes in John Berger and me. Let us remember that maybe Berger's most famous book, At the Crossroads Between Art and Politics, bears the title Ways of Seeing, and came out in 1972 as a kind of reflection of a TV series on BBC. Moreover, Berger somewhere wrote that migration, I quote, forced or chosen across national frontiers or from village to metropolis, is the quintessential experience of our time. These are also words that kind of struck me a lot. And it is easy to understand that John Berger continues to provide us with crucial tools and instances of work, methodic instances of work that continue to be very important today to study what continues to be the quintessential experience of our time. As Pierluigi was saying, John Berger and Me, the book that we discussed today, is not an academic book. It is rather an intimate account of a weave of tales around a friendship that started when Nikos was a PhD student working on Berger. The whole book is organized around the focus of friendship. Nonetheless, the tales that compose it address a multiplicity of topics, from art to migration, from motorbikes to travels and films, from food to politics in the way of the dissolution of the USSR. I repeat that this is a book on the 1990s. Just to start our conversation, I will say some words on two issues, or maybe more precisely on two resonances that struck me while reading the book. The first is a kind of resonance, I repeat, between the portrait of the Gastarbeiter, the guest worker, the migrant guest worker in A Seventh Man, and Nikos' family history of migration. When my mother read the Greek translation, Nikos writes at the very beginning of the book, she sighed. This is my story. It is written as it was sitting on my shoulders. These are the words of Nikos' mother. I think this is quite moving from the point of view of the narrative of the book, but it is also interesting in terms, of histories of migration, because we are confronted here with what I like to call the resonance between the history of migration in Europe, let's say from Southern Europe to Northern Europe after the Second World War, and the history of migration to Australia. Geographically, we are of course confronted with different kind of landscapes, but also from the point of view of the very experience of migration, there were significant differences. And so I think that the resonance that Nikos produces between these histories is a kind of important contribution to starting a new way of doing research on different experiences and histories of migration in the wake of the Second World War. The second issue I want to quickly discuss is somehow related to the first one. It is again possible to describe it in terms of a resonance. Of a resonance between the village in the Swiss Alps where Nikos visits Berger, and the villages in Greece from where his family migrated to Australia. I think that this kind of parallel, if you don't like the word resonance, is another leading motifs in Nikos' narrative in these books, and it leads him to dwell at length on the figure and the experience of the peasant. Some of the most intense pages in this book are dedicated to the peasant, are dedicated to its role in modern revolutions, starting with the Greek Revolution in 1821, and then discussing the role of peasants in revolutions in the 20th century, from China to Cuba and Vietnam. But the main point in these pages is the disavowal of peasants in modern theories of social and political transformation. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented, Marx famously writes in the 18th Brumaire. This is a kind of statement by Marx that has been critically discussed by many scholars over the last 40 to 15 years, to 50 years, starting with Edward Said in Orientalism. Through these debates, the peasant has become kind of emblematic figure of the subaltern. And a reflection upon subalternity is one of the I find in these pages a kind of melancholic tone that has to do with the way in which we imagine the effects of modernization on the presence and condition of peasants. But at the same time, there is also the awareness of potentialities that are hidden in the experiences of peasants and other subaltern subjects, and that can be, in a way, rescued in our present. So I think I spoke a bit about mobility and visual politics. Let me conclude by saying some words on the third keyword that figures in the title of our seminar, which means cosmopolitanism. As I was saying, one of the topics discussed in the book is politics in the wake of the end of the Soviet Union. And there are many interesting passages in the book, both regarding Nikos' kind of position and regarding John Berger's. John Berger, Nikos writes, was both a romantic and a Marxist. Quite interesting. But above all, he adds, John Berger was in every sense a cosmopolitan. So I would like to hear more about this cosmopolitanism that you associate with the experience of John Berger. As far as I am concerned, I would stress the fact that this book, I want to repeat it, is dedicated to the 1990s. This is important with respect to cosmopolitanism, because the 1990s were a decade of intense discussion and, let's say, testing and reframing of the notion of cosmopolitanism. Hybridity, the keyword that figures in the subtitle of the turbulence of migration, as well as creolization, were considered potential forces of a new vernacular cosmopolitan. Just think of people like Homi Bhabha and Paul Gilroy, who wrote quite extensively on this new cosmopolitan configuration that they saw emerging in the framework of globalization in the 1990s. I think that the situation we are facing today in this respect is very different. It's very different and requires yet another theoretical innovation if we are to reframe cosmopolitanism as an effective political force. And I think that to do that, there is a need of a new conceptual grasp of the world, or of the planet. We can also discuss the difference between the world and the planet. We know the enemies of cosmopolitanism, and I would add internationalism, are on the rise, are on the attack in many parts of the world. not only in the US and in Europe. We need to fight them back, to quote a song by Lyndon Kwesi Johnson. But to do that in an effective way, in an age of war, in an age of genocide, we urgently need new conceptual tools and a new vision of the world. So maybe also our discussion today can make a contribution in this direction.
Thanks very much, Sandro. I don't know if Nikos is better to use the microphone or not.
Yes.
I'm not sure, but we'll see.
I didn't use it.
No, because I think that Tom, they listen better without, but we can try. If home you don't listen very well, just tell me. I leave the floor to you because I think that Sandro raised several issues that we will go into, but I leave the floor to you to answer to these issues that Sandro raised, and then we will talk more how you wrote into the book about that.
Okay. First of all, let me express my real profound gratitude in an intellectual sense, but also gratitude with pleasure, real pleasure to be amongst friends. Luigi, Sandro, others in the room. So it's really lovely to be, my first time in Bologna. I've been to Italy many times, but it's a thrill to be in this diamond of a city. And I am a long-standing fan of both of these men. The work that Sandro has done, in particular around borderless method, as Pierluigi's already said, is path-breaking. And when my book, The Turbulence of Migration, came out, I was a young academic, and it was I think my third book, but someone told me that a review of it had come out in Italian. And I was really excited, so I got my best friend who was Italian to translate it word for word. And she was an Italian high school teacher. So I'm struggling, this is a very important essay this man has written. And of course, it was by Sandro. He was the first person to review it. So I will never forget that, of course. But it's true that both the books that we're discussing today are dedicated to a millennium, 1,000 years ago, it seems. You know, the 1990s in comparison to today seems like it is a different century, but it feels like a different planet. And it was also the time that, as Sandro says, Italy had that profound transition from being a country of emigration, and a lot of your ancestors and relatives came to my country, Australia, or not my country, as if I own a country. But it became a country of immigration, where people were migrating to. The same thing happened in Greece. So I was very conscious of this upheaval in the identity of these countries, because for a long time, these countries saw themselves as giving people to the world, not receiving. And in fact, I'll never forget going to this island, Zakynthos, where a lot of Italians, Venetian, and going to send a postcard back to Australia, and it had 3 categories to put your letters in: internal, external, Australia. As if there was this third space, but it was because there were so many letters going to Australia that they needed a separate, letterbox for that. And that showed how powerful the diasporic links between these countries were. But now it's the other way around. It literally is. And this shift has created a huge paradigm shift in the identity of these countries and a lot of resistance. So a lot of the work that we need to do now is not only just to acknowledge this transformation, but to start to think about how we start to see these changes. And we can take a clue from John Berger's work. from 1975. Because as Sandro quite rightly says, the best way to understand a phenomenon is to take the position and then adopt the perspective of the people who are experiencing the most rough part of that journey. So if we really want to understand the changes of our phenomenon, literally walk the mile in the shoes of the people who are going through this journey. The experience and the knowledge, the categories and the language that you will then form will be radically different to that which is told from above. And it's that contrast between seeing things from inside and literally following the journeys. Because this is exactly what John Berger did. At the peak of his career, he was at the pinnacle. I was just telling this to Pierluigi at lunchtime. In 1972, John Berger was as famous as anyone can be. He was like a rock star. He was on the BBC all the time. He had his TV series, Ways of Seeing, which was a big hit. Ways of Seeing was then published as a book. Thousands of editions had come out all over the world. He wrote novels, some of which was mildly successful. Then he wrote one which was set here in Italy, called G, and that won the Booker Prize, the most prestigious prize in literature in the world, apart from the Nobel itself. And upon winning this prize in 1972, what does he do? He makes a speech at the Tate Museum, which he decries and criticizes the Tate, which is the founders of the Booker Prize as well, for being beneficiaries of slavery, because the fortune was made from extracting sugar in the Caribbean. So these days, of course, it's common to decolonize the institution and to expose the links to slavery, etc. But this was 50 years ago. He had not only the insight and the courage, but also the self-sacrifice to say, with this money, I will choose what to do with it. And he gives half of the money to the Black Panthers for their revolutionary struggle for the liberation of Black people. And they used that money to buy a house. And I'll tell you a funny story about that sometime later. And the other half of the money used to finance the journey that he took with the photographer Jean Moore to write A Seventh Man. So he literally went to the villages of Italy, Yugoslavia, Greece, saw the men meeting in the coffee shops with their suitcases, followed them to the bus station, got on the bus with them, where they got off at the train station, and then take the trains to Stuttgart, to Düsseldorf, etc. So this migrant's eye that we are told to trust, that Sandro has correctly picked up, is extremely important. And it's interesting how translations sometimes make an author's intention more visible. Sandro mentioned that the book was translated immediately into Italian, but when Ways of Seeing was translated, and I helped a little bit with this, into Greek, the translator decided not to use A Way of Seeing as the title, but used the three terms icona kiblema, image and gaze.
In Italian too.
In Italian too.
In Italian it is questioni di sguardo, issues of gaze.
See, so the word gaze is, I think, so much more pertinent than seeing.
Yeah.
Seeing is important, but to say image and gaze, sometimes these translations get to the, people talk about lost in translation. I talk about found in translation, because as much as you lose, you find. So this is an important point, because in my book on John Berger, the first sentence is migrants made modernity. The modern era was made by these disruptions. And this is, I really want to stress the resonances that Sandro has correctly identified in terms of the status of the migrant in the modern world. Because when I was a student in your position, it was a marginal status at best. It was a problem that the society needed to overcome, or something that they could effectively ignore because it was so minor. But now, of course, that issue has escalated and exacerbated. And because I was seeing this issue from the eyes of the people like my parents, and I was not prepared to, I feel ashamed, which is what was the dominant order trying to make me feel, to try and repress your own experience so that you fit in to the and assimilate with the dominant order. I found it disconcerting and disturbing that the stories and narratives and the political theories that I was being presented with disconnected with the experiences and knowledge and understandings that were being formed in my domestic life. I remember one of my professors making me read a book about how migrants failed in politics. I didn't even read the essay, I just turned around and said to him, do you think maybe it's politics that has failed migrants? And so the purpose of that book, The Turbulence of Migration, was to develop a new vocabulary, a new perspective, a new positionality to understanding the phenomenon. And my struggle was against two dominant narratives. The first dominant narrative was like, migrants are really good, they're energetic, they're powerful, they're they're go-getters, they're the best. They left their country because they're dynamic people. And these people will be good for your society because, they're entrepreneurs, they're hardworking, they make sacrifices. So the story was all about their individualism. It was all about their agency. And it was all about how they make connections, like chain migration, that enables other people from their communities to come to here and therefore build a new kind of society. So that was one liberal, positive narrative. Of course, it could be turned in a negative way, but let's stay with the positive. The other dominant narrative at the time was the Marxist one, which focused on structures and looked at the way in which states and economic agents could control and regulate the flows. And I was fascinated by these images. The one which was like Brownian motion, that image of Brownian where all of these little crazy little things happening. That's the individualistic metaphor. Whereas the other one was all about equilibrium. A machine that can turn on and off. Migrants come in when there's economic need, when there's times of economic no longer need, we turn off the machine so that we close the doors. And so this lever of this and these shutters and these gates become the dominant metaphor in the structuralist narrative of migration. And to be honest with you, I found both arguments very compelling. And it's very easy to see how they operate, especially when you listen to the political rulers of your society. They're constantly using the same metaphors. Either this, we need to be in control, we mustn't be flooded by these migrants, or the migrants are, good for us, etc., etc. So I thought, no, it's actually, we need a different metaphor, different vocabulary. So turbulence was in fact drawn from not just the experience you have when you're in an aeroplane, but also to do with this complex interaction between the individual and the general, between the micro and the macro. And that is not linear, and it's not certain, and it's not consistent. It can produce unexpected shifts and turns, new eddies can form, new pathways can be structured. And so this to me seemed a more compelling metaphor for the way in which change actually occurs in the world. It's not just all about the individual, and it's not just about the state. As important as those two factors are, the interplay between the micro and the macro produces another reality which also deserves attention and deserves to be understood. And so, again, if we stick to people's positions, look at the way in which they are traveling, try and identify the perspective to which they are seeing the world. Then new vocabularies, new other words will come. And again, Sandro is 100% right. History is written by the winners. In Greece, the 1821 revolution was always told about these enlightened elites. Enlightened in the sense that they adopted European values, the dominant Western values of the Enlightenment, and were trying to present that to Greece to liberate itself from the Turkish occupation, as if the Turkish occupation was what kept them in the age of darkness. Well, in some ways, we should be grateful it was Turkish occupation and not other forms of occupation, because the Turks were not as backward and as dark as other empires were. In fact, they were more welcoming and hospitable than some of them. Ask the Sephardic Jews, for example. They would rather be in the Ottoman Empire than in the Spanish one, let's say, for example. But I mean, so these are easy stereotypes to portray. That, you know, the Eastern were dark and backward, and the Western were enlightened and forward, right? But putting aside what the actual dynamics were of these two systems, which I can talk about at length at other times, the fact was, you know, Lord Byron is sort of taken as this great hero for Greek revolution, you know, the great poet from England, who did come to Greece and he did catch malaria, and that's what killed him. It wasn't a battle wound. In fact, he was better in bed than he was on the battlefield. But it wasn't people like Lord Byron that made the revolution happen. It was the peasants. They were the ones who got up and said, no, this is not good enough. They were the ones who said, we want a different life. They were the ones who actually did not just the fighting, but had the question in their head already. And where did that question come from? I believe it comes from deep internalization of very ancient pagan as well as Christian and contemporary and modern ideas about individual freedom and about collective rights and about their own sense of culture, reacquaintance. So this, can the subaltern speak, is a very powerful point that Sandro makes. And Marx was a little bit derisive and dismissive and a little bit too quick sometimes with this idea of the peasantry. And Gramsci, another great figure from this part of the world, did a great job in correcting some of those distortions. But the big challenge is, can we listen? And if we are to listen, with what tone? It's another beautiful word that Sandro identified, the tonality. And he mentioned that the tonality of my book is melancholic. It's true, that is the soundtrack of my life, melancholies and elegies. And with John, I also discovered that he shared that in music as well. And one of the songs we often played was by Gavin Bryce, Jesus' Blood has Saved Me, and people like Tom Waits as well. But I think these elegies and this elegiac music and melancholic tone is a very important point for us to think about in our contemporary world. And that is the point of how close life is to death. The power of the elegiac is that it holds these two points exquisitely together. Life and death, death and life. And this oscillation between what is hidden and what is visible becomes very powerful in that kind of tone and that kind of music. And this complex reflection about death and life leads me to the final point that Sandro makes. And excuse me for being so parasitic on you, but you're absolutely spot on in terms of your trajectory. And I'm just literally just being Nikos in the footsteps of Sandro now. because we really do need a new understanding of cosmopolitanism. In the 1990s, there was this enormous enthusiasm for cosmopolitanism, because in the 1990s, it was the period of optimism about what globalization was bringing us. And there was this naive now, belief that the internet and greater mobility with cheaper travel, appreciation of the benefits of cross-cultural exchanges, visible transitions of societies that were emigrating to immigrating. There was this optimism that the EU was going to be a model that others would follow rather than leave, that the new instruments that the United Nations would bring into the world would become more powerful rather than less. And so there was this moment of like, maybe the world is heading towards some kind of better place. Maybe Kant was right. You know, because Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, believed that there was some hidden force in history that would eventually take us to the destiny of humankind, which was cosmopolitanism. Everything was inferior form of governance and self-realization. In cosmopolitanism, he thought, was the most secure political order and the greatest opportunities for the realization of your identity. And so a number of scholars were really thinking it's time to update Immanuel Kant, and, you know, whether it was Jürgen Habermas in Germany or David Held in LSE, or even Craig Calhoun to a little bit, where there was a certain enthusiasm that this was a positive moment. But, you know, no sooner does a good idea come into being than other malevolent forces hijack it and adopt it for their own benefit. In fact, just today I was reading something in the Guardian that said, well, I saw the title at least, that don't blame woke politics for Trump. And in fact, it was a criticism of the elites who had hijacked the idea of woke politics rather than the actual content of the idea itself. And so that patrician class, which uses woke politics as a lever for their own validation and political power struggles, that was more of an issue than otherwise. But that's a distraction, sorry, let's put these parentheses away. But my real point here is that we need to return to cosmopolitanism. And that book, John Berger and me, was written in the mornings of the 2 years of COVID, well, actually about 6 months. My full-time job was writing another book, which is called The Cosmos of Cosmopolitanism. And that was meant to be here today, but it somehow got lost in translation. Lost in translation. That is an example here. And in that book, I've tried to resurrect a contemporary meaning, and why I think John Berger still is a good example of the cosmopolitan. And that is because, not because he was curious about other people's cultures, and it certainly wasn't because he liked to travel, because he hated travel. He would go on travels as far as his motorbike would take him, but never on an aeroplane. In fact, he had a chronic fear of aeroplanes. So he only went once to America and he hated it. And he went. And once he was asked to review an exhibition in Russia and he went there by boat. And so it wasn't travel that broadened his mind. So he wasn't cosmopolitan in that elitist sense of wanting to see the world. He was cosmopolitan in that more fundamental, ancient definition of cosmopolitan, which was a believer of radical equality. When the Stoics defined cosmopolitanism in the 3rd century before Christ, before Christian era, the Stoics said, you are cosmopolitan irrespective of race, class, or gender. This was for the first time that we have on record, at least, that someone talked about equality in that radical way. No philosopher that we have on record spoke about being equal to a shoemaker or being equal with a woman from another culture. The cosmopolitans believed in this radical idea of equality, and they believed also that our wisdom and creativity come from our connection to the cosmos. So it was this profound and radical idea of political equality with this most epic notion of scale in terms of belonging. And that I believe is a valid starting point for rethinking how we can feel and think about belonging in a contemporary context. Because one of my deeper concerns for this book, this John Berger book, which was set in the 1990s, but speaking to the present, and what the Cosmos and Cosmopolitnism book is trying to do, is to say, how can I have a conversation with now also people who are indigenous in Australia, the Aboriginal people of Australia? And the expectation often in Australia is that I have to go and learn and submit myself to the authority of the indigenous elders, which I truly believe is a worthy activity. However, I also believe that one of my obligations is to go back into the archive of my own civilization, my own culture, and find what resources are there that are valid for having an ecological, cosmological, political conversation about equality and belonging in the contemporary world. And to that benefit, I think cosmopolitanism still provides a little bit of a torch. But maybe that's enough for now.
Thanks very much for this beginning of the dialogue. And I should say that, I mean, I discussed several times with Nikos about these topics, but also was very interesting to read the book. And as I told him when I finished to read the book, I said, this book is a sort of, I mean, I felt a little bit kind of ashamed because I was traveling into the intimate life and relationship about two intellectuals, because through this memoir on the relationship with John Berger, also Nikos is doing a sort of, how can I say, psychotherapeutic exercise into your own life. I mean, there are all the relationships. And the way also the book is written is very interesting because it's not an academic book, so it's more kind of jazz to me, because sometimes there is a melody, then it stops, then there is an image, then there are some ghosts, then there are some theories, and then, you know, but also the reason. So I would like to read a little bit, because we were talking, I mean, Sandro was mentioning the resonance between the common stories of migration, right? We went in Venice a few days ago with Nikos to follow the steps of an ancestor, and he was telling me that the grandmother of Nikos, Papastergiadis, was a refugee from Greece, from Trebisonda, which is now in Turkey. And then we discovered why in Italy we say perdere la Trebisonda, but I won't tell you, then you will go and look for it. But was interesting also this idea of being the child of peasants, of migrants, and then working with, I mean, that period that Nikos Papastergiadis was doing his PhD in Cambridge with Tony Giddens. You write here Tony, then I discovered that Tony is Anthony Giddens. And then John Berger was like the character of this PhD. So he went to interview John Berger, and then he spent like many summertime by the motorcycle on the Alps with John Berger, and then other. But then the way also you talk about John Berger and migration, in page 180, you write, a migrant's eye. Yes, that now seems obvious, but what is it? And then you mention many scholars who tried to talk about that, right? Since Dante, Nietzsche, Calvino. But what these great minds all saw was that displacement was essential for critical thinking. It was not just a matter of contrast and evaluation, but also a willingness to challenge the singular measures that each culture produced for its own making sense of things. And then I just go on. No one has ever called him a migrant or a refugee, say John, right? Was he an exile? I mean, you are talking about John. John Berger was never called a migrant or a refugee. And why he was on the Alps? I mean, was he in exile? There is such a moral burden that comes with these labels. And we talk a lot of labels here. There are many students and PhD students, we always talk about labels, about frames. And I'm not sure he bothered to check. His energy was in contesting the hierarchies that asphyxiate us all. John trusted the migrants' eyes, of course. Some migrants move in search of fame and fortune. Most, however, live because they have no choice. They live to survive, to find a glimmer of freedom. And this was like the same reason that the parents of Nikos moved to Australia, right? For hope, for different. So when then talking about John Berger, say, when we passed beggars and street peddlers, he emptied his pockets. He was saying that John gave money to the Black Panthers. I was more conflicted. Nietzsche confessed that didn't like giving to beggars, but he also was not proud to walk by and do nothing. John looked into the eyes of migrants, not only to convey his empathy for their suffering, but it was also an inquiry. He tried to read the signs of the journey that they had undertaken. He often changed the circumstances in his life to have a closer look at how life had changed for others. He joined the circle of exiles and emigres in London. He followed the journey of migrants from the rural south to the industrial north of Europe. He lived with the peasants in the Alps of France. He needed to grasp the truth of their point of view, and in this, he was sure that there was also a measure of what really counts. Which is interesting because here there is again this idea of equality. But I'd like to ask you, because really, while I was reading your books, both, I mean, Sandro and Nikos, to me it was also like an opening about a different methods, a different positionality. And now I remember also, I mean, once, I don't remember if we were here, and there was a class by Sandro Mezzadra, and I was a student, and I say, and then I went to Sandro, and I say, but Professor, how can you think about a world without borders? And he told me and laughed and said, how can you think about a world with borders? I mean, we imagined it, and then now we are living in this kind of world, right? So try to challenge it. And then I started like my critical reflection. And so now I'm telling to my students about, you know, passport index and the borders and whatever, the making of the borders, the making of migration. Here, Martina is also with us. So, I mean, I want to ask you, like, what kind of suggestion do you give to young researchers while we have to deal with these kind of topics? Because right now we are talking about cosmopolitanism, but we are in a world that is full of borders, identities, belonging. And so, I mean, being like a philosopher, sociologist, cultural researchers, what is your suggestion on what was your experience that make you shift the perspective and go on the border or on the other side of the eye of migrants?
To Sandro, to me?
To both. It's a ping pong.
Okay, I will, well, enjoy the spin. When Sandro provoked you to imagine a world without borders, does that mean a world without territorial definition? Or does it mean a world without that specific kind of geopolitical organization? So, of course, it's easy when we listen to the populists to conflate the two and say, if we lose borders, we also lose any attachment to space and place. But traditionally, for millennia, borders is a new phenomenon. It's a phenomenon of the modern era. But attachment to place, of course, is ancient. It's fundamental to human. And, you know, there's a classic text in sociology, which is the book by Thomas Zaniecki and Florian Thomas and Zaniecki, the Polish peasant, it's called. And in this book, it's trying to understand consciousness of these peasants, and they say, where do you belong? And you know, and normally someone asks you the question, where do you belong? And you say, I live in Strada Maggiore, Bologna, Italy, Europe, etc. Right? And the peasant says, well, you see those two stones over there and there? I live more or less between these two and here. And in other words, the territory does have a boundary, but it's not as organized as we think of it today. It's respected because they know that someone can only plant here or someone can only put their cows there. And the same is true even in indigenous claims of land in Australia. There is this huge myth about when the white English colonizers came to Australia, they made a claim of terra nullius. No, there's no, you know, no land. No one owned the land. And it was only almost 200 years later when one gardener who was employed by a very famous historian, an indigenous person, said to that historian, and then went all the way to the Supreme Court of Australia and says, on my island, I can show you every blade of grass and which family histories it's connected to. And so there is a genealogical, there is a cosmological, there is a territorial, there is a historical connection to land, which is fundamental to humans, right? But is it organized in this divisive, politically contested, violently aggressive way? Or can it be organized in a more collaborative and more different kind of attitude? So I think, you know, when you put the challenge to us here, Luigi, to explore other methods of thinking about territory in a globalized world, I think that's a very profound challenge. And it does require us to explore the histories of attachment and detachment that have occurred from the ground up. Because remember, I said this story of contestation of Aboriginal land rights begins by a man who is working as a gardener for a historian, not on his island, at a university. So he's displaced, he's deterritorialized. But his memory, his oral knowledge has not been deterritorialized. It's still connected. But it is connected but disconnected. And in a way that has sharpened his critical thinking. And that's what that passage you read, Pierluigi, has highlighted. So I think to answer your question in summary, we should follow in the footsteps of people like that, at least, and then find other things. Sandro, what do you think?
Well, let me start from the title of your book on cosmopolitanism, The Cosmos of Cosmopolitanism. I like very much this title because I've been thinking for some time now that the whole discussion of cosmopolitanism has focused quite unilaterally on the politis, on the citizen, while the way in which we imagine the world of cosmopolitanism has remained kind of obscure. And it's not a secondary issue. We cannot imagine the world as a smooth space. No. And too often in discussions of cosmopolitanism, it has been taken for granted that the world is a smooth space. This has a lot to do with what you were saying now about territory, about belonging. I think that we need to reframe cosmopolitanism in terms of a variety of belongings.
Exactly.
If I think back of the 1990s, of people like Homi Bhabha, Paul Gilroy, from which I have learned a lot, I mean, there was a tendency to emphasize very much the territorialization and the experience of minorities. Of course, minority is not simply a statistical concept. In those discussions, very often the reference was Deleuze and Guattari, so kind of very generative understanding of minority. But, you know, I think we should look for different kind of directions of thought in order to combine multiple experiences of belonging, because otherwise you have the majority against the minorities, as it is happening today, and it is happening not only in Europe, in the US, it is happening in India, for instance, you know, in many places in Africa, and so on. So this is a question I think we have to pick up again. The question of borders. Let me say that I have always been much more interested in struggles surrounding borders than in the imagination, the normative vision of a borderless world. Struggles also provide us with a kind of razor that allows identifying the borders that have to be abolished. Because not all borders are equal. And this is, of course, an important point. As far as my modest experience is concerned, you know, I discovered this question of borders when I was living in Genoa in the early 1990s. In the summer of '93, there were quote unquote race riots, among the first in Italy, you know, and we immediately tried to do something. You know, I was politically active, as I have always been and continue to be. And we met migrants, and I started listening to stories regarding transgressing borders, transgressing and crossing borders, international borders, to come to Europe, but also encountering everyday borders in the city. So for me, this encounter with migrants was kind of double discovery. the discovery of the issue of international borders. I had never thought of international borders as an interesting kind of political issue until then, and it was a generational experience, at least in this part of the world. But also the fact that borders were proliferating within bounded spaces, within the space of the city, for instance, the space of Genoa in that case. You know, in 1993, I had just finished my PhD. My PhD was on German constitutional history. It was on the origins of the Weimar Constitution, 1919. So I was doing completely different thing. But that experience, you know, displaced me, challenged me, and I started also to change my research agenda. I was quite quick doing that. And so this is my own experience with borders, let's say, as an activist and as a scholar. And I conclude by saying that talking migrants at that time in Genoa, mainly from Senegal and Morocco, I also started to understand that they had practices, you know. They had not only political practices, but very mundane, vernacular practices that allowed them to abolish borders in their everyday life, you know. And so I started to think, okay, this is important, not the normative vision, I repeat, of a world without borders. This is the important thing.
A very, very simple, can I add a little footnote? A very similar starting point exists for me as well for this Cosmos book that you mentioned, because the title is very powerful for me at least. Because as Sandro says, in the 90s, all the discussion about cosmopolitanism was how it was a globalizing political normative agenda, how we could make better political instruments, how through economic transformations, new cultures would be, migration would make the world more hybrid, etc. I think all this is important, but something different also is happening. And it comes back to what Sandro just says about paying attention to what's happening on the ground. In his case, it was the refugee struggles in general. In this instance, for me, it was me listening to artists, because one of my other jobs is to write essays for artists in catalogues and for exhibitions and biennales, etc. So I've done hundreds of those essays. And one of the phrases I hear often is when an artist says, I feel a connection to the cosmos. The most brilliant and beautiful example of this is a Korean artist called Lee Woo-fan, who makes single stroke paintings. One brushstroke is the sum total of his painting. He says, one breath, one brushstroke, one cosmos. And he means this literally. Literally. Thousands of articles have been written about Lee Woo-fan that all mention this, but no one knows what to do with it. Because in our art historical training, we look at form, we look at context, we do even a bit of psychoanalysis. But how do we understand cosmology? It's a big black hole in our training. And so I thought, like Sandro just says, you know, take it seriously. This is not a book about cosmopolitanism and the normals, the rules, the polis, but it's about the cosmos in cosmopolitanism. Because the word has two words, cosmos and polis in the word. Why is it the first word is understood in a very specific way? Because when I read the ancient Greek definition of cosmos, I found three definitions for cosmos. One is the one that you can say But the ancient Greeks didn't use it this way. In the modern Greeks, you say the world is cosmos. Okay, the planet Earth. The ancient Greeks never said that. They said gear. The other one is you can say refer to the people of the world as the cosmos. So there's a political and an ethical definition of cosmos automatically. But the third and most important meaning of cosmos was aesthetic. Cosmos was the activity of making order that welcomes a stranger, that emulates the divine. An activity of making a space hospitable to welcome a stranger and to emulate the divine. We have the word cosmetic in English. When we make our bodies more beautiful for others. We also say we make a cosmos in our own homes. We create a little universe in our own homes. And so I thought to myself, what would happen if we took this aesthetic, not normative, aesthetic angle as the starting point for rethinking global belonging in the 21st century? How do we do that, Pierluigi? I don't know. I can only start. You've got to find the next step now.
Yeah, great, because you can pass from cosmology to cosmetic and talk about, a cosmopolitan world, or maybe more about an individualized narcissism. But we still have time, eh? So if you want to walk, you can walk around, don't worry. I mean, feel free. Yes, that was ringing before. But I also want to open to you, also because I was just thinking that today is November 25, and this is the World Day Against Violence on Women. So being in Italy and someone in the government said that the patriarcato and rape culture doesn't exist, is finished in the 90s, whatever. So I think it's important also to acknowledge that today we are 3 males here, but fortunately there are so many women here. So I hope to open the floor and to include you in our dialogue. Really, I read a couple of, again, passages of the book because I like the way also it is written, just to recap some of the thought that you were sharing now. Page 72, I'm just opening, and the chapter is Memory, Jealousy, Eros. Midway through writing this book, I had a dream, and then there is the dream, and then the dream woke me up. And then the same year, as Theodore and my father, writing this memoir has returned me to stories I have told my friends again and again, but it has also turned up so many unexpected connections. Finding these lost thoughts is like discovering an unexpected current running through my body. My ancestors and John's neighbors lived a similar life. There is an uneasy symmetry between his journey from the London art world to the French village and my parents leaving their Greek village in Macedonia as peasants to become wogs that turned the cogs, which is, I think, an Australian way to call the gastarbeiters, in the factories of Melbourne. How to bring forth a history that silenced the voice of the peasants. These peasants lived without records. Their stories are in the rhythm of their dance, the patterns in their woven rugs, and the structures of their houses. Can memory bring everything back? And then it's interesting because someone was saying to John Berger that he was a storyteller, right? He was proud to call himself as a storyteller. Somehow this title covers all the bases: poet, revolutionary, philosopher, artist, writer, moralist. It gave him the license to explore his instincts and reflect on the experience of others. So what you are saying is maybe also John Berger was a very good listener, because you are telling us that you listen to some stories of migrants along the borders or whatever. And then there is another part, like a few pages later, where Nikos writes, I don't want to die because I don't want the memories I hold of all the people I love to disappear. So it's interesting how we can pass from, I mean, the micro to the micro and the intimate parts. But really, I would like to open the floor to the other people. So we still have half an hour, so we have plenty of time. And so if you want to comment, to ask, to suggest, to, you know, just tell your stories and put here so that we can mix all the stories together, please.
Yes, I have a question. You said that it's important to take a position from the perspective of migrants to talk about migration. I was wondering why can we find there that specific position that we cannot find elsewhere to explain this phenomenon? Why it's so important?
That's a very good question. You're saying why? What is it? What's distinctive about that? Okay. Well, it's because your training can only do so much. Whatever philosophical, historical, political training you have can do a lot, perhaps, in order to present you with a worldview. But worldviews are mutating. Worldviews are constantly morphing into other things. And the worldview that we form in a university is based on the knowledge of other people over a long period of time. And the worldview that is occurring on the ground today may still have resonance, to use, which is a beautiful word, with the worldview that was formed in that philosophical, sociological tradition. But it may not. There might be disjunctures, or there might be things that we are deliberately learned to not look at, which is called institutional blindness. And so the only way which we can either calibrate our worldview with that of the migrant is by encountering, by establishing some dialogue where my perspective, my vocabulary comes into contact with that of another person. Sometimes it can cohere, sometimes it just completely misses, right? And so that is one phenomenon where you literally encounter the disjuncture between your worldview and that of another person, or even your own experience of a worldview with that which is the one that you've been trained to recognize. And sometimes you feel that tension in you before you go outside. And even that is adding another dimension. So we're already talking about 3 worldviews now. And if I was to extend from the passage that Pierluigi has just read, there's a 4th reason. That occurs in the writing, in the moment of writing. So let me recap. There's the worldview that Sandro gives us. Perfect, but not quite perfect, even he admits it. But very good. It is perfect. But sometimes his worldview and mine, as a child or as an adult growing up, is explaining a lot of things, but other things are not, and there's a tension. And hence, you know, like Pierluigi asked the question, right? And so that tension is in. And then you go out into the world and you find some other people, it's the 3rd worldview. But my 4th one is that when I was writing this book, the John Berger and me, I was not writing it thinking I was writing a book. In reality, a friend of mine asked to give a lecture on John Berger. And I said, yes, of course, and I was going to give a normal academic lecture. But it was during the time of COVID, and my home was 7 kilometers from my university. And the government had put a 5-kilometre radius, so I couldn't travel to my university to get access to my library. So I thought, how am I going to give this lecture without my tools? And then I thought, oh, well, it's COVID. Maybe we should be a little bit more free with ourselves. I'll write it from memories and stories and anecdotes. And who cares? You know, it's COVID. We should be more relaxed about these academic things. So every morning I would write for 15 minutes, sometimes half an hour at the most, 1 or 2 pages. And sometimes after 5 or 10 minutes of writing, I would start laughing to myself, because things were coming out that I didn't expect. I wasn't just extracting the memories that were stuck in my head and then just putting them to paper. Other rivers were running through me. Other things were coming into collision with what I was writing about, and so I just let them happen. And this disjunction between what I thought I was going to do and what actually was coming out on the page was quite interesting to me. And it was like, as Pierluigi said, it's a bit like jazz, and I let it be free. If I was writing an academic lecture, I don't know, maybe I would have suppressed and repressed that freedom and never let it out. Because I would have said, but first I have to get a current right or something like this, you know. But so the creative process of writing also takes you to another world as well. Or that enables other worlds that are in you that were latent or you didn't have a fully knowledge of. So, sorry, that is a very, very important question. It has 4 layers to it.
Are there other questions? Please.
Thank you very much for bringing all these issues and especially for reminding us that borders are a system of injustice. So it's very important in these dark times, and also that cosmopolitanism can be an aesthetic issue as well. So these are 2 very important points to me, and also for inviting us to look at the world with the current and future challenges through new conceptual tools, and also to find a new vocabulary. This is extremely important because in order to go out of our ethnicentrism and so on. In my small world of research, I'm trying to do it. So I'm trying to use and also the term use, I would like actually to learn from subaltern epistemologies, indigenous knowledge, for example, to connect also with other groups that are beyond the Western world, for example. In my research about activism and migration, I'm getting really attached, also emotionally, I have to say, to Gloria Zalua, for example. But I don't know, my question is, in this quest for new conceptual tools and also new epistemologies that are different from the ones that we use to see the world, is there a risk of cultural appropriation? Because I feel sometimes a little bit like that. So I fear when I use these new lenses, or alternative lenses, to look at the world, I really fear to, how can I say it, to reproduce the same systems of power imbalances that I try to fight. I know it's quite a challenging question, but I think that is somehow connected to what you were saying and the challenge that you put on the table today.
Should we pick several questions? Because I saw several arms, also like Monica or Martina. Yeah?
Yes, I wanted to go back to John Berger and cosmopolitanism together in this as well. You wrote our article on cosmopolitanism, so I don't want to, go too much in that other direction. But you said that John Berger was a real cosmopolitan because he believed in life and equality, and I wonder whether you can also connect this to this distinction you make between ethical and aesthetic cosmopolitanism and the visual, and maybe these ways of reasoning and seeing that John Berger had.
Thank you, Martina.
I have a question about this attempt to follow the journeys of the migrants, right? And I'm trying to think, okay, what would you write, sorry, John Berger's Today, 10 years after the start of the so-called refugee crisis, right? And I'm thinking, I mean, about the role of memory that you mentioned at the very end. And I'm wondering if you can say something more about how can we use this on a political level, right? So what is the role of memory if we produce memory in the way that you described? So by following the journeys of the migrants in order to understand the changes that happen in the level of this phenomenon. Because in relation to the question that you say that it's not sufficient to ask acts about to speak, but also can we listen, right? And so what is like kind of like attempt to follow the journeys of the migrants from the point of view of the traces of memory that are sedimented also in relation to the last 10 years, right? Can do politically. And the second question is related to what you said that the turbulence of migration was a kind of like way to challenge these two kind of analysis. One is that the liberal approach, basically, and the other was the structural Marxist approach. And I'm wondering if, I mean, how this politics of encounter that you just described with the migrants can have overcoming this this opposition, right? Because it's not only at the level of the analysis, but also what the analysis. So what is the level of, in a way, collective struggles against this repressive politics? If there is the risk of like sticking to this individual level, but at the same time, this collective level, of course, cannot be taken for granted. So in which way this politics of encounter that you mentioned can produce a kind of, I don't know, meso level or whatever?
Great questions. And in fact, the three questions work well together as one, and I'll answer them not separately but collectively, if that's okay. Because they are deeply interconnected questions. In terms of the first part of the question about appropriation, I think that's a profound question now, especially when in places like Australia we have explicit protocols for filmmaking and writing, which explains very clearly the level of consultation you should do and the amount of research that's necessary before you publish or make a film that represents an indigenous culture. So that I think at the surface level is a minimum of good etiquette. Etiquette, you know, this is politeness or everyday research activity, right? You know, basic standards of conduct. But I think the question goes much more deeply than polite referencing and accurate footnoting. And the question goes to the heart of how knowledge is produced. There's a very famous American anthropologist called George E. Marcus, and he has this fantastic phrase called epistemic partnership, which has become a slogan for me about collaboration. Because epistemic partnership came to him when he first did his fieldwork as a student in Fiji or somewhere, I can't remember, one island in Mississippi. And he was arriving as an American student, and he had the feeling that the local Fijians saw this white American anthropologist coming, and they said, "Oh my God, here comes another one. We better put on the old dances," right? So they were going to perform to him what they thought he needed so that he could get his PhD, so then he could fuck off, right? And so this was the sort of superficial level of extractionism that, you know, anthropology was committed to. But he wasn't that kind of guy. And he just wanted to, as I would put it, hang out. And by hanging out, you learn to realize what the first principles are of their culture and yours, and whether they have in any way a possibility of making something new. Not being equalized, but actually being into an encounter with each other so that the interaction between these principles produces something new. So his whole methodology of epistemic partnership is that when you meet a stranger, it's not that you are there to absorb their worldview and then repeat that in the royal cook, you know, that distinction fashion, so that you can demonstrate that you've extracted, extrapolated, and refined the culture of the other and made it explicable. But rather, you recognize that as these two people meet, they're not going to just take something from each other, but they're going to make something. You know, even in a conversation at dinner, you might say, Jesus, I came into dinner thinking that this is what I needed to do. Now I know that I think I need to go a little bit more that way. That's new. So this making of something new is so important, and it is new knowledge. And it's also a fundamental expression of what culture is. Culture is a dynamic force. It is not a static supermarket filled with objects that you can extract things from. These are things that are constantly leaking and making themselves dynamic. So that's a very, very important point. And this leakage and dynamism comes to the core of the kind of aesthetic cosmopolitan John Berger is. He wouldn't, if I said to him, you're the real cosmopolitan, he would just labels. What do you need labels for? I'm not a Coca-Cola bottle that you need to sell, you know. He doesn't understand that. He doesn't care about these things. But the point is that if you start from the pleasure and also the interest in the other, then you are producing something that is not just ethically responsible, which is the bare minimum of etiquette, but it's also creatively productive. But these days, to do what I've just described is almost impossible. Because, and this is where the crux of your question is, because, you know, how do you follow the journey of someone who is incarcerated or who has been so segmented and has been, you know, kept within a boundary of isolation from you? You know, in Australia, we have become, from this really happy country, that's a popular image of Australia, perhaps until the 1980s and 90s, to the world champions, exporters of the militarization of migration policies. It's been my dying shame that the ideas that the far right are aspiring to for 20 years in Europe, aspiring to, have already been realized 20 years ago. 1 month before 9/11, Tamworth, which was this boat that rescued refugees in the north of Australia. August 2009, not September, August. And the Prime Minister says that boat will not land in Australia. They had to land in Australia, there was nowhere else to go. So what did he do? He says you can land on that island, but that island is no longer Australia. He took the island off the fucking map. He excised the territory politically, even though geographically it's still part of Australia. Called Christmas Island. You look at the ironies, right? Welcome to Christmas Island, but you're no longer in Australia. Therefore, you don't have the rights of refuge, right? And ever since then, the refugee has been treated as someone who can be put in a place that is in limbo, outside of territorial frameworks for geopolitical rights, but also beyond the gaze of the critical subjects like yourself, journalists, and the people who are employed to work there have to sign contracts that they are forbidden to reveal any information about the conditions and lives and experiences they actually go. Some of these people, God bless them, have said, I don't care, I'm telling the world. Some of the parents or relatives of these people have broken the rules. And then there are some angels. I mean this literally, angels that have come from another planet, like Beirut Buchani, who was a refugee on one of these islands, Mama's Island, not Christmas Island, and with his, not even, you know, this is a really high class one,
I don't think so. It's an old one.
Well, to me, it looks state of the art. Well, he had an old Nokia. And on his old Nokia, he would write every day and send WhatsApp messages to his friend at the American University of Cairo, who would translate it and send it back to us in Australia. And we started publishing them in magazines, catalogs, and newspapers. And that also became the book, No Friend But the Mountain, which is one of the most powerful political philosophy, anthropology, policy, and poetics of the refugee stories you can imagine. It's incredible. And it was written on WhatsApp messages. Yes. Angels. Now, anyway, my point in all this is it's become much harder to follow the refugee in the way John Berger did. No one said to John, you can't go to Greece. No one got in his way when he followed them on the bus or the train. No one blocked his entry when he walked into the huts in the pub in Dusseldorf or Germany. Yeah, he had access. A friend of mine, Hoda Afshar, a photographer, in order for her, before Beirut Buchani's book was published, to make a video documentary and video artwork in collaboration with Beirut, had to produce the most elaborate subterfuge of claims of wanting to be a tourist on that island. And then he had to arrange with various guards that he was going on another island for a little fishing trip so that the two of them could meet and collaborate in the production of these works. Now, eventually, these stories come out. Eventually, people protest at the walls of these sequestered spaces. Eventually, information is leaked. But this is like, in a sense, providing us with the concrete details, which is epistemologically profound. But the moral point was visible a long time ago. Before 9/11, within the first month, every former Prime Minister, both left and right in Australia, every leader of the church, the Catholics, the Greek Orthodox, the Imams from the Muslims, all the heads of psychiatry, all the legal experts, all the top economists in Australia said it's politically unsound, it's morally indefensible, it's humanitarianly cruel, it's economically unviable, and we are creating trauma that is going to spread all across this country. This message was pronounced loud and clear to all the mass media. And the Prime Minister, who said no to the elites, became more popular. That was the most devastating moment in my political life. To have the experts being told that you are destroying the reputation of the nation, and that person gaining 10% advantage in popular appeal and winning the next 3 elections. It's at that point I decided that the battlefront is no longer normative, because they were the champions of the normative world, and they lost. The battlefront is affective, because that Prime Minister mobilized fear, and we didn't have enough hope inside us. We had reason, but not enough hope to overcome the fear.
He told you that he's melancholic, so with this melancholic notes, I think, I mean, that we should, I mean, we have to cross because I know that there is another class, so I'm sorry if there are other questions, but I invite you to come here and to talk directly with Nikos and Sandro. Again, thanks very much for this dialogue, and I hope you have the chance to read the book. You can find online because it has not been translated in Italian yet.
Yeah.
So.
That's your job.
Yeah. Yeah, let's say ciao to our friends who are online also.
Ciao.
Thanks very much. Have a nice day.